All right, thank you all for joining us today for this very important call with State Representative David Gomberg. So David, let's go ahead and get started. Everything is changing and ever moving. So just wanted to get a couple of updates. I know you've got a special session this week. So yeah, I'm sure you've got plenty to talk about and tell us. So thank you for being here.
Always a great pleasure to join the Lincoln City Chamber. And yeah, I do have a lot to share. I wish I had a lot of good news to impart on all of you. But the best thing I can say is it's a beautiful day outside. Take a couple of minutes, go out and embrace it. I'm going to touch on three things today because there is a lot going on, and I want to make sure I get time for questions. But the three things I want to talk about is, first of all, our current COVID environment here in Lincoln County. Second of all, I want to talk about the special session, which is going to be held on Wednesday this week. And then I want to talk about the state budget overall. And again, I don't have a lot of good news to share with you. I don't have to tell you that we are facing daunting circumstances here at the beach. In Lincoln County, we have got the highest unemployment in the state, about 26%, which is the kind of levels we were looking at during the Great Depression. And that's not surprising given our reliance on the tourism industry and in hospitality, where there had been so many layoffs. On top of that, we have got one of the fastest moving outbreaks in the state. And so that is landing on us with a thud. And thirdly, I will remind you that here we have over 1/3 of our population over the age of 65. Those people are considered vulnerable. So we've got an outbreak, we've got unemployment, and we've got a high proportion of our population vulnerable to COVID. And that is proving very, very serious for all of us. Let me talk about that another way. So we've got the tourism industry, which Lincoln City focuses on so much. And in the tourism industry, it's like our greatest fear is also our greatest need, that we want those people to be coming over here. We want them to enjoy themselves. We want them to spend money. But we're concerned that when they do come over here, that they bring infections with them. And we have challenges getting them to follow the guidelines that we are following here ourselves. That's what we're looking at in the tourism industry. Our second largest employer in Lincoln County is fishing and to some degree agriculture. And what we're talking about in those industries are perishable products. You milk cows even when you don't have a place to sell the milk to. That fresh crab sells for more than frozen crab does. And if you don't have a market, you lose money. And you can freeze all the fish you want, but that means when you bring it into the marketplace next year that the price goes down on those commodities. So we're trying to sort out what we do in our processing industries, which are not going to have long-term consequences for the pricing we get. And our third industry, and we don't often think of it as an industry, but it is, and it's the retirement industry. And I mentioned to you before that so many people in that category are vulnerable to COVID. And so it sets up some inherent conflicts between bringing visitors in and the concerns of retirees that they are bringing infections with them. And you are seeing that play out, whether it's in our grocery stores and the simple act of wearing a mask becomes a political statement. We're seeing that play out in some of our communities that are concerned that we're opening up our parks or our waysides and it's bringing in more visitors. We're seeing conflicts emerge. So that's a quick overview of what's going on here in Lincoln County. What can we do about it? Well, at the legislative level, I have been struggling to get some dollars into our communities to address the specific needs that we have here. To support our small business community, to support our small business development centers, our community colleges, to reimburse our cities for the dollars that they have already put out, like the $600,000 that Lincoln City spent in our small business community a few months ago that came out of our lodging tax dollars and won't be available when we need those dollars later on. So I've been trying to get dollars allocated from the federal money that's coming into Oregon. And I'm running into some challenges because the strategy has been to allocate those dollars on a per capita basis. Now let's think about that. Per capita seems fair enough, but it doesn't mean anything out here at the coast where we've got a town of 7,000 people that could have 30 or 40,000 people on a typical summer weekend. So we need an infrastructure for 30,000 people. We need public safety, police and fire for 30,000 people. We need to support a business community that is designed for 30,000 people, not 7,000 people. And I have been having a great deal of problems getting those dollars allocated in a way that is meaningful to us. $75 million was going to be spent on small business supports during the last e-board meeting. Coastal legislators were successful in getting that pulled off the agenda and sent back for further review. But I don't know how that discussion is going to evolve. It's currently underway. All right, I'm going to change gears now, and I'm talking fast so I can get through this and then get to your questions. There's a special session that the governor has called starting on Wednesday. Let me tell you, there is nothing special about special sessions, although this one is going to be particularly unique because of the rules that we are implementing that are going to dictate how we legislators interact with each other in a COVID crowd. And we've got special rules that talk not only about wearing masks, but about we stay in our rooms and we watch the debate on television, and then when it's time to vote, we'll be called down to the floor in small groups. More significant than how it affects me is how it affects you, because the building is closed, and that makes it more difficult for people to comment or observe the legislative process. And we are shifting much of that to electronic participation. I guess you can call that good news because it's easier to log in from Lincoln City and share your comments with a committee than it is to get in a car and drive over, which is the normal process. So we're watching for how the process evolves. What I can tell you is that we've got about 28 measures that we're going to be dealing with during the special session. That's remarkable because normally a special session only deals with a very small handful of topics that are more or less pre-approved going in. The three categories of measures we're dealing with were, first of all, COVID-related issues. And that has to deal with how does local government manage open meeting requirements when we don't want to get crowds together. And we need to change the statutes so that they can go to Zoom meetings for budget hearings. We're changing the rules regarding notaries so that you don't have to be there in person to notarize a document. More significantly, we are talking about moratoriums on evictions so that you can't kick people out of their houses for not paying their rent or their commercial mortgage. And also, we are talking about liability issues for small businesses, particularly now focused on hotels and motels. So that's one category, and I'll come back to that in just a second. The second category of measures is a handful of measures designed to deal with police accountability. I would say to you that I think it's largely focused on things that have evolved in the Portland area. It's never bad to talk about police accountability. We have a great relationship with our police force here in Lincoln City, but there are issues that are being proposed that would deal with prohibiting chokeholds, creating a database when police officers break the rules, requiring other police officers to intervene if they see the rules being broken, and some other things dealing with accountability in the arbitration process. So those are on the agenda. And then there's finally a third category of bills that I call everything else. And it's kind of a hodgepodge of measures, the most significant of which is a series of corrections to the corporate activity tax, which went into effect earlier this year. And it would make some adjustments in that. One in particular will be of interest to our neighbors in Tillamook County, because right now the law says that if you sell your milk to a co-op, you're exempt from the tax. But if you sell it to anybody else, you're subject to the tax. And the changes would now exempt all sales of milk from the corporate activity tax. So I wanted to talk about that, and I know you've got some questions, particularly regarding the eviction rules and the liability rules. Let's save that for a minute, because the third thing I want to get to before I get to your questions is the state budget. Oregon's not bringing in the money that we had anticipated. People aren't working, so they're not paying income taxes. Businesses are closed, so they're not paying corporate taxes. People aren't driving, so they're not paying gasoline taxes. And the businesses that operate most of our video lottery machines are closed, and so we haven't been bringing in lottery dollars. And that means that our budget is substantially short of where we expected it to be. That has got short-term and long-term consequences for all of us. We are now in the process of reducing state budgets, and I expect we will have another special session before the summer is over to make some of those adjustments. In the meanwhile, the governor is paring back on state expenditures to the tune of about 18%. Well, what does that mean here in Lincoln County? Well, one example was just posted today. State Parks relies largely on day use fees and camping fees for their budget. They haven't had any camping fees for the last few months. They have decided not to reopen a series of state parks, and that will include our beloved Devil's Lake State Campground will not be opening this summer. That is one example of how that hits us here in Lincoln County. Another example is, as we reduce the budget for Senior Services Division, one of the items on the cut list is the Project Independence, which provides support for a number of seniors and keeping them out of nursing homes, because it means that people drop by their homes delivering warm meals and checking on them once or twice a week. That's in line to be eliminated, which is of great concern to me. Let me give you one more example, and that has to do with lottery sales. When we sell lottery tickets, we invest those monies in veterans and on economic development and in schools, but we also use those dollars to support the sale of lottery bonds. And we use lottery bonds to pay for infrastructure here in Oregon. If it sounds like I'm talking another language, let me bring that into sharp focus for you. We were going to use lottery bonds to pay for improvements to the Oregon Coast Aquarium. We were going to use lottery bonds to begin the process of replacing the Big Creek dams in Newport. We were going to be using lottery bonds, and this just breaks my heart, to pay for improvements, $1.5 million that I got improved for the Lincoln City Cultural Center. All of those expenditures are now in jeopardy because we don't have the dollars necessary to support lottery bond sales. A glimmer of good news I saw this morning is that while they suspect they're going to have to cancel the bond sale this year, they may be able to carry some of those over into 2021 and pull out a few dollars for the many, many projects around Oregon that were going to be funded with bond sales. The fight will be whether our projects are on that list or not. So there is 15 minutes of the lightning round, talking about the circumstances here in Lincoln County, talking about the special session, and talking about the state budget. Let me catch my breath. And Lori, I know you've got people that have asked questions in advance. I don't see any in the chat column yet.
Yes, but I've got one. If we can circle back to state parks for a minute. I've been hearing from a lot of business owners that now that state parks aren't open, of course, the restrooms aren't open. And if their business is near, a parking lot or a state park, then they are getting inundated with people using their restroom. So what, if anything, can be done about that?
Wow. Well, remember, you're talking a guy who once upon a time owned a business, a retail business at the Dee River Wayside, and we pointed across the street to the public restrooms. I don't have a great answer for you, Lori. I think there will be increased pressure, forgive that awkward pun, for people to use the restrooms in our private businesses. I hope that our city can also step up and make sure that there are public restrooms in city parks that are available to fill that gap. State Parks has made it very clear that their biggest challenges in this budget environment are picking up trash and cleaning the restrooms. That's where they spend most of their personnel time. And you're right. they're not opening parts, so that means they're not opening the bathrooms, and people are going to still need those services. So there'll be increased pressure on our retail businesses to allow the public to use those facilities. I can't think of any laws or rules dealing with it, but there is good common sense dealing with it. So let's be kind to our visitors.
Yes, absolutely. All right, another conversation that I've been having a lot is you touched on the liability from the business standpoint. So, you know, I'm looking at it, it's kind of like after 9/11, the insurance companies were required to add terrorism coverage, and you either accepted it or you rejected it. So couldn't something like this be required as, you know, a virus coverage that you either accept or reject?
Well, you know, buying extra insurance is one option. I'm looking at something a little simpler, and that is simply saying that you can't sue a business because you believe you may have caught the virus there. Let's just have a liability waiver and say that there's no retail or business liability for COVID, and people could not submit those suits. Let's be clear, if somebody wants to sue the Chamber of Commerce because they walked in the door to pick up a brochure and thinks that they got COVID there, it would be difficult for them to prove that, but you know that you still have to defend yourself. Or your insurance company would have to pay to defend you, or possibly just settle the case and make it go away. And one way or the other, that's going to cost you more money. So the special session has one of their many proposals to say that hotels and motels that are acting as homeless shelters cannot be sued by people living there in a homeless situation if they believe that they caught COVID. And I'm saying, how come we're saying homeless people can't sue, but other people using the hotel can sue? That doesn't make any sense to me. And I've also asked the question, does this apply to our vacation rental industries? I am one of a handful of legislators that have submitted a proposal for this week saying we want to waive liability in the business community for COVID-related claims. And we want that to be in hotels, motels, VRDs. We want that to be in retail shops. We want that to be in a corporate manufacturing environment. And oh, by the way, we want that to apply in our schools as well. I have submitted that request, and I've said if we can't get it done this Wednesday, then let's move it up and have it high on the priority list for the next emergency board, which I expect, as I said, we'll be having before the summer is over with. It's really, really important, and it's of great concern not only to the business community and the state chambers of commerce, as you know, but increasingly also to public entities that include our schools. And if we mentioned that the cities want to open our bathrooms, what do we do when somebody says, hey, I used the public restroom at 15th Street in Lincoln City and my kids got sick? And they suddenly, they want to sue the schools. So I'd like to see a broad waiver in place, and I have already submitted that proposal.
Okay, so follow-up question to that. Does the liability waiver apply to customers only or to employees also? What about employers who are trying to protect their employees?
Well, I'm trying to get a better understanding of how workers' comp relates to COVID claims. If there is a broad liability waiver, then I would believe that it applies to both employees and to customers. And my chief of staff, Tyler, is online, and I'm watching to see whether he nods yes or no. Did I get that right? That the waiver would apply to both employees and customers?
Yep, that's correct. And the workers' comp presumption is part of that discussion as well.
So Lori, you're watching for questions. Let me raise another one that's giving me a lot of heartburn. It has to do with a moratorium on evictions for people that can't pay their rent. I mentioned to you that there's 3 proposals coming to the short session. One would extend the moratorium on residential evictions. One deals with commercial evictions, and one of them has to do with mortgage foreclosures. If you own a house and are having trouble paying your mortgage on that. And Many, if not most of the landlords we have here in Lincoln County are what I call mom and pop landlords. They are not big companies. They're people that bought a second or a third or a fifth home that they rent out to provide some kind of income in their retirement years. And now we're seeing situations where we're saying, if somebody can't pay their rent, you can't kick them out. Which makes pretty good sense on its face, but I want to remind you of a couple of things that are already going on. The first one is that the employment division is paying unemployment benefits to people who have lost their jobs or are underemployed right now. And the federal government is augmenting those payments with an extra $600 a week. Now, for those of you that write these monthly reports, as I do in my business, you know that if somebody is making $15 an hour, then they're entitled to $390 a week in unemployment benefits. But at 15 bucks an hour working full time, they were earning $600 a week. And now the federal government's going to add to their unemployment, giving them $600 a week. So they're getting the $600 they would have earned plus another $390 on top of that. They're making more money not working than they were when they were working. And if the employment division could actually get those checks out to people, then they should have the money they need to pay their rent. That's item number one. Item number two is that the emergency board where I serve has put out about $85 million to assist people with rent payments if they are unemployed or underemployed. So even if you're not getting your unemployment check, we've got subsidies available that can be used to pay your rent. And that money is supposed to go directly to landlords. Those are two major steps in place to make sure people have the resources to pay their rent. Now we're going to say that we're going to add to that the fact that you can't be told to leave because you're not paying your rent. Why would anybody, well, you know, a good people will pay their rent and they'll take every step that they can. Not every tenant is a good person. And I have heard horror stories from people saying, your lease expired and you're not paying me and you're telling me I can't make you leave. I'm hearing horrible horror stories, and I am looking closely at this this eviction moratorium to see how it lands on small landlords here in Lincoln County. That's an issue of great concern to me. I see minimum wage goes up next month too. I don't see how you're going to be able to pay that. The minimum wage changes were approved 2 years ago, and they stair-stepped. They go up at predictable intervals. And yes, there is another stair-step increase that's scheduled for next month. I'm trying to recall exactly what that's going to be here in Lincoln County. Tyler, was that 13 and a quarter? What was the actual number in Lincoln County?
I believe it's 12.
12. And for many of our businesses, see, I get confused because it's different amounts in different parts of Oregon. It's different than Portland, and it's different in Eastern Oregon than it is here. So it is pretty confusing. So we're going to go up to $12. A lot of our retail stores are already paying more than $12, but I think that's of great concern in our restaurants where they may be paying a lower minimum wage and augmenting their compensation with tips, with tip income. So yeah, I think that's going to be problematic, particularly in our restaurants and bars. And oh, by the way, we got some changes that meant that that instead of closing earlier, you can now stay open until 10 o'clock. Well, this week it's still light outside at 10 o'clock, but you got to close the bar. I don't see any sense at all in this 10 o'clock mandatory closing time. I'm trying to get that pushed back further, but it's an ongoing debate at the state level.
All right, David, there's a long question in the chat that people on the phones might not be able to see, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it. Our city council discussed enforcement of the mandatory masks. It was made clear to them the police will not be burdened with this because it will be enforced based off complaints to OHA on businesses, and that individuals will not be ticketed. Rather, businesses that do not properly enforce this will be subject to fines. I am concerned with this mandate enforcement falling seemingly entirely on businesses to enforce and interpret. To equally enforce this rule at all times in my business, I need extra staff again, while being threatened with more potential hard to understand fines. Can you speak to the liability enforcement of this? And we spoke to minimum wage. I don't see how a bar is supposed to be able to make it.
Well, I understand the question. And let me say, first of all, that I am pleased that we are moving toward mandatory, quote unquote, mandatory masks, because I think in particular, the visitors that were coming in were less likely to be using those masks. And I think that it was of great concern to people that live here. I think it's a concern to businesses that that are worried about their own exposure as well. I think that the mandatory mask, which was approved by Lincoln County, which was approved by a lot of the cities in Lincoln County, and finally was also imposed by the governor, is a step that I'm not uncomfortable with. Now let's dive in a little bit deeper and say that mandatory masks are not universally mandatory, because if you are concerned about other health consequences, you're not required to wear a mask. And there are other exemptions regarding whether or not you think that that you may be at risk for racial profiling. You may not be required to wear a mask. And I liken it to the situation we already face with service animals and comfort animals. When somebody comes into your business with an animal, you're not allowed to ask them, is that if you're required to have a service dog. You're only allowed to ask the more limited questions in terms of what kinds of services does your service dog use. I think you're going to have people, and if you confront them about not wearing masks, they are going to either give you an explanation dealing with healthcare or become belligerent. So I think it's very difficult. My understanding is that you can be cited for not wearing a mask. Now, whether our police force wants to get into that, or whether they have higher priorities with domestic and sexual violence on the increase, petty crime on the increase, and a number of other issues facing them, I don't think they're going to be out writing mask tickets, but they do have the authority to do so. I'm not clear that a business is liable under OSHA rules if they don't demand mask uses. And again, I'm going to look to Tyler, who often has a better understanding of some of the specifics there. Tyler, do you have any feedback on OSHA rules regarding mask compliance?
It's changing by the moment, and the mask guidance just came out, so we're asking these questions right now. I do see a question from Marcy in the chat about being between eating and drinking. I have not seen that. Because I think you run into the question of, do you have to mask up between every bite or every sip? That's not exactly what we've been seeing. But we're asking the question about, for a small business owner, exactly Marcy's question is, to what extent do you need to have somebody surveilling and making sure that people aren't coming in? And the clearest advice that we've been given at this point is just like the chamber has made up for folks. It's sort of like the no shoes, no shirt, no mask, no service. Hopefully people are going to act in their own best interest and in the best interests of others.
So you saw in my last newsletter, I talk about caution, courtesy, and common sense. And I hope that courtesy is going to be the norm rather than confrontation and discourtesy. Let me touch on another subject, and that has to do with people who were self-employed or gig workers and made claims for unemployment. This is what we call the PUA category, and those people are entitled to unemployment compensation. The problem is that the employment division wasn't ready for them, and the software was not ready to address their claims. And so roughly 100,000 Oregonians made claims in that new category, excuse me, and 70,000 of them are still waiting. The employment division, with its new director, has released a plan where they are trying to ramp up response to people who are in the PUA category and waiting for benefits that they're entitled to. And they're increasing their addressment by about 25 to 40% a week, which means that they expect to get through those 70,000 people in the next 5 weeks. I'm hopeful, but also guarded in my optimism that we're going to get help to those people. But another 5-week wait is of no comfort to anyone who has already been waiting 3 months for benefits and wondering how they're going to pay the bills as they've worked their way through their savings and run up the maximum on their credit cards. There's progress being made, but sadly not enough of it. PUA continues to be a great concern. So what other questions do we have?
Well, there's one, David. I'm going to take it back to the special session. So it's about the mood in the Oregon legislature. Has it shifted from one of partisan bickering and refusal to even talk together to one of cohesive cooperation to help Oregonians in this time of pandemic, overdue social and institutional change, and economic depression? Well, there you go.
Well, let me start with this. We're not allowed to talk to each other anymore. I'm going to go to my office for 8 to 12 hours on Wednesday and come out of it probably for a half hour total to work my way to the floor, cast my vote, make a speech, and come back to my office. So we're all going to be in the same building together, but not going to be face to face. But that's not really the question. The question is, what's the mood and how are people interacting with each other? I would say that, that there's a great deal of stress. I'm stressed, just like all of you are stressed. I think all of the members are stressed and doing the best they can to take care of their district. My district is unique. I work very closely together with other coastal legislators to promote concerns and to advocate for addressing our unique circumstances here. The legislators in Portland are doing the same thing. The red legislators in Eastern Oregon or in Central Oregon or Southern Oregon. I will say to you with some frustration, there are more legislators in the metropolitan area than there are on the coast. And so they tend to get more of what they are looking for than we get of what we are looking for. But there's also a great deal of, I won't call it confusion, I will say, and I won't call it anticipation, but we're kind of caught between the two, waiting to find out what exactly we are going to be voting on. I'm on the emergency board. The last emergency board was meeting to disperse $300 million on a Thursday afternoon, and I found out the specifics on a Wednesday afternoon. That's not a lot of time to dig in and do a good job of reviewing those spending proposals. So I mentioned to you there's about 28 bills that we are going to be voting on next Wednesday. We got a list of topics last week, and then at the end of the week, we got a list of actual written proposals, the legislative drafts. We got those on Friday afternoon and began to work our way through them. A committee will be meeting, a special appointed committee will be meeting at 3 o'clock this afternoon to take testimony on some of those bills and begin to work their way through them. We're waiting to find out what we're going to be voting on. Many of us have frustrations that we are not dealing with budget issues when the budget situation is so difficult and consequential. The governor has said that she wants to wait until we find out whether the federal government's going to send us more money. They've sent us $1.6 billion so far. We don't want to meet and cut programs and then find out that the federal government is sending us enough money that we didn't need to cut them all. But we don't want to wait so long that the budget consequences are compounded before we begin to take action. So I know that some of the Republican members are arguing that we should have focused this meeting on budgets. Some of the Democrats feel the same way. But for now, we are focusing on those those three categories that I told you about. I, speaking for myself, have a great relationship with my Republican colleagues. That particularly includes Republicans that represent the coastal districts, senators and representatives. We work very closely together. But the mood amongst the legislators, I think, is there's a fair amount of stress in how we work our way through this and trying to make sure we get it right when we're dealing with short deadlines and complicated measures. If I spent 5 minutes answering that question and it doesn't seem like I gave you much of an answer, that may be an answer in and of itself.
All right, thank you. So you had also talked in your last newsletter about schools and what that might look like this fall. Can you kind of touch on that subject?
Well, I tried to put out an outline of the plan for students returning to schools. And each of our districts is being asked to put a plan together. So that is underway, and those plans are supposed to address the local circumstances. So we will be watching closely to see what Superintendent Gray, her board, and her staff come up with as we look forward to taking our kids back to school in the fall.
Well, and one big part of that will be daycare. You know, what are parents going to do for daycare if the school isn't in session? So that was a piece of the puzzle too, wasn't it?
Well, that's always been a huge issue for us out here at the coast, and the emergency board has. I'm trying to see which finger Joy is showing me there. Excuse me. The emergency board allocated some additional money for daycare. I was pleased to see that. I think we need more money for daycare, and you're absolutely right. As people begin to return to work, you know, it was tough enough when people weren't working and their kids weren't going to school. At least they were all home together. And that's generally a positive environment, except that we did see a spike in domestic violence, and we saw a spike in child abuse during those difficult times as families were dealing with stress and were cooped up inside with each other trying to deal with it. The additional child care dollars are going to be important, but having kids return to school is going to, I think, relieve some of the pressure on child care needs when parents are working but kids are at home. Short answer is we put some additional dollars out for them. I don't know if it's going to be enough.
Okay, because that's one thing that I had been working with some of the facilities here in town to expand their daycare offering, but there's a lot of restrictions put in place that they have to, you know, mandate before they can open. Do you see anything, you know, loosening those requirements?
Well, what I have seen is it's become a lot easier to become a daycare provider. The application process has been fast-tracked. So if you want to open a daycare center, it's easier to do that than it was before. But yes, there are restrictions on daycare facilities, and we want to make sure that when kids go to daycare or to Head Start or to other programs like that, that they come home as well as as they felt it when they went.
Yep, for sure. So I don't see any other questions in the chat. Does anybody have any questions?
I want to hear from some of you. Tell me how you're doing. Marcy and I talk quite a bit. I get some pointed emails from Charlotte. Lucinda and I correspond regularly. Mary Jo doesn't hesitate to reach out. But tell me how your businesses are doing in this unprecedented environment.
Well, I know a lot of people have been having very upset customers, you know, over the mask situation. So I don't know if that's going to change on Wednesday when we can say it is required per the governor, or, you know, I know that the people that I've spoken to this morning over the weekend had lost, one of them, half of their customers due to not being able to, whatever, to wear the mask.
Can you tell me what kind of business that was? I'm not asking who it was, but I mean, are we talking retail, or are we talking
Retail.
a retail business said no mask, no service, and people refused to come in?
Yep.
Well, somebody asked, why did the requirement take effect on Wednesday? I think that was to give people time to react to it. We've expressed some frustrations that rules come down on different business sectors almost overnight, and they don't have time to make adjustments. I think we wanted to give time to everybody, both to educate themselves and their customers, but also to get masks and to be in a position to respond to this new requirement. I think that's why we took about a week to implement the new rule. I guess the good news is we can blame the governor instead of blaming the business owner. But I think there will be a learning curve there, and I think that there will be some resistance.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, let me add another aspect to this, which I find really fascinating, not necessarily in a good way. Pacific Seafood had an outbreak, and they then tested all of their employees. They tested about 350 employees, and they came back with 120 positives. But they also found out that 95% of the people that tested positive were not showing any symptoms, which means that they were either asymptomatic, meaning that they had it but were never going to develop any of the symptoms, or they were pre-symptomatic, which means that they were going to start showing those symptoms later on, but they were still able to transmit the virus to somebody else, 95% of them. Now that created problems, because how do you convince somebody to not go shopping or to not interact with their friends when they feel perfectly fine? And how do you convince them to get their spouses or their family to stay home when they feel perfectly fine as well? I asked the health division whether this 95% number was consistent with what they were learning. Well, their answer was typically bureaucratic. They said, no, we're only getting about 10% of the people we test are asymptomatic. But then on further questioning, they admitted that we're only testing people that have symptoms. So they test people that have symptoms. Most of them are positive, and the positives mostly have symptoms. I actually was curious why 10% of the people that they tested who had symptoms didn't have symptoms after they were tested. But the real issue there is that we've got a lot of people walking around that have this thing that don't know they have it. And that's why masks become important, because masks, as we know, are less effective in protecting you, but more effective in protecting other people from you. And if I'm waiting to hear the results of the weekend testing in Newport, where they went door to door, and find out whether this 95% number holds up, or whether they were having a less number of positives that were asymptomatic. That's an important part of this conversation, and it's an important part of the mask conversation as well.
Yes, that will be very interesting. So another question, when do you expect Lincoln County to move into phase 2?
Well, I was very relieved that they did not downgrade us from phase 1. And the governor's office seems to have a commitment that they don't want to go backwards for anybody. The first thing we have to find out is what happens with our outbreak. And it's as long as the outbreak continues to grow, it's going to be difficult for us to get to phase 2. That's going on. The other important part of this conversation, I think, is that the number of positives is going to become less important, and the number of hospitalizations is going to become more important. We've had, I believe, a total of 4 hospitalizations for Lincoln County residents, one of whom was out of county when they became sick. They were tested, they were hospitalized someplace else. Another person who tested positive here was actually so serious they transported them to a hospital out of county. We know how many beds we've got available. We know what our hospitals were able to deal with, but it's important to keep track of not only how many people are positive, how many people have symptoms, but how many people have symptoms that are so severe that they need to be hospitalized. that's all part of the conversation about advancing to phase 2. I don't see it happening in the next month.
Yes, you're right. It'll be very interesting to see the results from the tests in Newport over the weekend. Probably by what, Wednesday they should be out, you think?
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we'll get that news very soon. And there is other random testing going on as well. Well, I'm still interested to hear from some of you and what it's like in your own business. The news that people were losing customers because of the mask requirement is distressing, disappointing.
So David, it's Nancy Oxenholt. I had a question on masks. So they put the bonus on business owners to provide the masks. So my pricing on masks, I could get 50 masks prior to any of this for $10.44. It's gone up to over $1 a mask.
So it's gone from 50 cents a unit to $1 a unit for you?
At least.
What about the free masks that the county was distributing? Are you seeing?
I've not seen them. I've not seen them. They distribute it on a Saturday when my business is open.
Of course.
The other thing is that, like I look at Safeway, for example, I was there Sunday, probably 10% of people had masks on. Most of the people were out of towners when you went into the parking lot. It was Idaho, it was Washington was probably the biggest. Now they just got over their big hump. And so it just amazes me that everybody's going in without masks.
Well, I agree with you. I was in Safeway on Sunday myself, so I saw the same thing you did. The availability of masks is of concern to us. I have had conversations with county emergency management, and I have an assurance from the health division that whatever Lincoln County wants right now, they're going to get. So if we need more masks, I don't want you paying $1 a unit for them when CERT volunteers are handing them out to the community. Nancy, Tyler's going to make a note. We're going to follow up to see if we can address your unique mask needs.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I did get an email from Jenny Damaris from the sheriff's office, and they are getting 30,000 masks and need help in distributing those. So I told her absolutely we would help. So I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but I think that's in the works as well.
Yeah, that's the number I heard, and I confirmed that if we need more than that, we can get them.
All right, so another question, could there be a consideration to move the restaurant sector to phase 2 statewide? There are only 3 changes made other than 12 a.m. curfew, plexiglass between booths, and karaoke, pool, and bowling being allowed. Everything else stays the same. So that's interesting.
That's a very interesting question. I have not heard suggestions on moving phase 2 by industry sector rather than by geographic sector. And even geographic is problematic. I mean, here in Lincoln County, we've got you could argue we got an outbreak in Newport, and so we're being kept out of phase 2 in Lincoln City. Excuse me. I'd point to Marion County, which has had challenges in downtown Salem, but stretches all the way up the San Am Canyon, or Lane County, which goes from Springfield to Florence. So counties are a convenient geographic area, but they're not homogeneous or consistent by any means. I'll be happy to raise the question about how we deal with certain industries, because it's going to take a pretty big restaurant to have an issue with whether we can have 25, 50, or 125 people under the roof. I'm also seeing some creative approaches. McMinnville is closing down 3rd Street so that the restaurants there can take their tables out into the streets. I'm seeing similar approaches in other communities. So the good news is that our businesses are remarkably creative in the face of adversity, and I sympathize with all the challenges that they're facing. But I welcome questions like the one that was just posed, and whether we can get a segment exemption rather than just simply waiting for the whole county to be ready.
All right, and then there was a comment about the 24-hour wait between each renting each room. But my understanding was Lincoln City lifted that, but I don't know of a date. Do you happen to know specifics on that?
Maybe somebody online here has an answer to that question. This was not a state requirement, but rather I think a local rule.
Yes. I see Scott Humpert on the line. Scott, do you have any information on that?
You caught me when I was eating.
Sorry.
I know that I believe it's at City Council tonight that there was going to be a resolution passed on the 24-hour rule. On a call this morning, there's a little distinction in there that they are amenable to lifting that rule, but there is, I think it's CDC guidance that says there needs to be a 24-hour hold if there is a customer that is suspected or has COVID-like symptoms. They would then shut that room down for for 24 hours. But to have a blanket 24-hour hold across the board was something that Lincoln City was lifting. And that came through a discussion this last Friday. Our city council met prior to a joint county call and it decided how they were going to address that, along with the county is reducing gatherings to 10 people, whereas Lincoln City is keeping the gathering size at 25.
Yeah, it's definitely getting complicated to keep up. I was going to send that out about the 24-hour rule, and I thought, no, I don't know enough about it, so I better not.
I think it becomes
confuse
official
things more.
tonight, depending on what council votes for.
Okay, great. And then just another reminder, tomorrow we've got a call with OSHA. And the reason that I pushed that up earlier is because of the statewide mandate or the countywide mandate for the masks on Wednesday. So hoping to get everybody's questions answered on Tuesday. So that's tomorrow at noon with Michael Wood, who is the OSHA administrator.
Well, before we break, I'll remind you, first of all, I'm putting out weekly newsletters and have been since this thing broke. These are not form letters. These are not boilerplate that we get information from someplace else and then just forward them on to everybody. I write those newsletters myself and try to make sure that there's some worthwhile content in there for all of you. I hope that you're all on my newsletter list, and I know the Chamber's been doing a great job of forwarding them on. Spread them around, and I hope that that people can use that information. Some of you have been very active. Thank you for sending employees or furloughed employees to my office when they are not yet getting their benefits, and I want you to continue to do that. Have them send us an email if they've got a claim number, a phone number, the last four of their social security number. That will save us a couple of steps. We are reaching out to the employment division and hounding them to help people get benefits that they are entitled to. That's also very important for people that are those self-employed folks that are in the PUA category that have been waiting even longer. Have them reach out to our office. We will do all we can to get them some additional support. Somebody asked, how do we get your newsletter each week? Just send us an email and we'll be happy to add you to our newsletter list. There's a link on my webpage and you can use that as well, my legislative webpage. But I think Tyler just wrote, if you've got unemployment claims, email them to us, and he put the address in the chat section. And that also goes for getting on our newsletter list.
All right, Wendy, can you quickly talk about the PPP changes? I know there's been some changes for the better on the PPP loan.
Yeah, so I just put in the chat a very long link, but it's to the SBDC Oregon has a webcast at 1:30 today that will be going over the changes to the PPP program and hopefully answering some questions about how to go about getting forgiveness of your PPP loan. So many of my clients, I'm an advisor at the Small Business Development Center, and many of my clients do have loans under this program. And many of them have used up the funds or are getting pretty close to using up all those funds. So that cash is running out, and now they're turning their attention to how do I get this loan forgiven? So I'd encourage you to watch that webcast. And of course, I'm available to answer questions and try to help with that process. But the new and improved PPP forgiveness rules allow 24 weeks to use the money instead of 8. 60%, at least 60% has to be used for payroll instead of the previous rule was 75%. The time period for repayment, if you end up with some funds that are a loan, is 5 years now. So the rules have been relaxed quite a bit. And if you'd like to learn more, I'd encourage you to copy that link or go to Oregon's SBDC and find the link for today's webcast.
Wendy, and I'm understanding there is still PPP money available at least US Bank, right?
Yes, there still are funds available. Not every lender is still doing the loans. US Bank is one I had heard late last week was still providing loans. There are also a number of online lenders you can go to if you can't find a local bank. I'll put my email address in the chat as well so that people can get in touch with me if they have questions. The EIDL program is also still open. That's a long-term loan program from the SBA. So if you need more information about the economic injury disaster loans, feel free to get in touch with me.
All right, one last chance for questions. Not seeing any. Well, David, thank you. Oh, there is one new message. Oh, it's Wendy's email. And I would encourage anybody, if you've got questions, because I've been calling people that were afraid to apply for the PPP, take another look at it because I think they've made it much easier. So Wendy, I give your name to everybody I talk to. Thank you very much for.
Yeah, I can tell. Thanks, Lori.
And we're fortunate to have such wonderful and proactive resources through the SBDC, through our WorkSource office. I see Heather's on the call. She does wonderful work for us. The Chamber, of course, has been on the front lines of all of this. So I feel like we're very fortunate in the face of all these challenges to have so many great advocates working on our behalf. And the business owners that, as I said, have been creative and forthright and communicated with some good ideas to my office. So keep those good ideas coming. I'm going to be following up on the notion of whether we can get an exemption to phase 1 for our restaurant sector.
Okay, great. And David, thank you for all that you do. Thank you for your newsletters. I know that I share them and I hear from people that, yeah, I get them many different ways, but hey, that's what I'm here for, to blow up your email, right? Have fun at the special session, and I'm sure you will keep us posted. Thank you for all that you do.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody for joining us.